So Jeffrey Sachs just delivered the most comprehensive and terrifying warning about American foreign policy in decades. And we're not talking about academic analysis of individual conflicts or measured criticism of specific tactical decisions. We're talking about one of the world's most respected economists and former government advisor standing before international audiences and systematically connecting the Trump administration's simultaneous Venezuela operations, Greenland militarization, and Iran escalation into a unified analysis, demonstrating that these aren't separate regional challenges being managed independently, but rather interconnected elements of a catastrophically reckless strategy that pushing the world toward potential great power war involving nuclear-armed adversaries, coordinating their resistance to American pressure across multiple theaters simultaneously. On April 2nd, during an emergency presentation at the United Nations headquarters in New York, Sachs unveiled what he called the convergence crisis, a meticulously documented analysis showing how Trump's attempted seizure of Venezuelan oil infrastructure, NATO's massive military expansion in Greenland, coordinated by Denmark, and escalating confrontation with Iran over its nuclear program are all following the same regime change playbook that has consistently failed throughout modern history. But now these operations are occurring simultaneously in ways that are forcing Russia and China into unprecedented coordination against what they perceive as existential American threat to their interests and security. It's honestly staggering to witness someone of Sachs' credibility and establishment credentials arguing that current American strategy represents greater danger to global stability than anything witnessed since Cuban Missile Crisis. But guess what? His presentation included classified intelligence assessments leaked by concerned officials, diplomatic cables revealing Allied alarm about American recklessness, and testimony from former senior military commanders, warning that current trajectory leads inevitably to military confrontations that could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. This isn't just about criticizing Trump administration's aggressive foreign policy or questioning whether specific operations serve American interests. We're talking about fundamental warning that the three simultaneous regime change operations targeting governments supported by Russia and China, combined with NATO's Arctic expansion that both Moscow and Beijing view as strategic encirclement, are creating a perfect storm where any incident in any theater could trigger cascading escalation across all regions simultaneously as adversaries coordinate responses and American commitments exceed capabilities to deliver on promises made. And trust me, the detail and documentation Sachs provided, connecting Venezuela's forced American evacuation to Greenland's militarization to Iran's nuclear advances, is forcing even talkish interventionists to confront uncomfortable reality that American strategy is failing across all three theaters while creating conditions for confrontations that dwarf risks of any previous period, including original Cold War. Let me fill you in on what's been developing over the past 6 weeks that led Sachs to conclude that separate crises in Venezuela, Greenland, and Iran are actually manifestations of single catastrophic strategy requiring emergency international attention. The foundation for his analysis was the February collapse of Trump's Venezuela operation, where American personnel were forced to evacuate under pressure from Russian military contractors and Chinese security forces after just 14 days of attempting to maintain control over Venezuelan oil infrastructure, representing one of the most humiliating American retreats in modern history and demonstrating that Russia and China were willing to directly confront American operations rather than accepting fait accompli, according to the New York Times reporting from early March. Sachs had been privately warning State Department and Pentagon officials throughout January that the Venezuela operation would fail catastrophically if Russia and China decided to oppose it, that economic sanctions had strengthened rather than weakened Maduro's position by allowing him to blame Venezuela's economic crisis on American aggression, and that attempting to seize another nation's resources through executive order would unite international opposition, including from traditional American allies who viewed such actions as violations of sovereignty and international law. Whether it was pointing to intelligence assessments showing Russian and Chinese military personnel pre-positioned to respond to American moves, highlighting how previous regime change operations consistently produced opposite of intended results, or warning that Venezuela operation would encourage Russia and China to coordinate resistance to American pressure in other theaters. Sachs really tried to prevent the disaster through private channels before it materialized, but his warnings were ignored by Trump administration officials committed to demonstrating American strength through bold action, and the predicted catastrophe unfolded exactly as Sachs warned, with forced evacuation, Russian-Chinese control over Venezuelan oil infrastructure, and international condemnation, leaving America isolated and humiliated. The Venezuela failure made it crystal clear that Russia and China had developed capability and willingness to coordinate direct opposition to American regime change operations, fundamentally changing calculations about what U.S. could accomplish through unilateral action. But here's where the rubber meets the road. Instead of recognizing Venezuela disaster as indication that regime change playbook no longer works in multipolar world where adversaries coordinate resistance, Trump administration doubled down on simultaneous operations in other theaters following the same failed template, creating what Sachs characterizes as strategic insanity, where lessons of failure are ignored in favor of escalating commitments to operations with no realistic prospect of success. We're now looking at comprehensive evidence that Denmark's Greenland militarization, with over 6,000 NATO troops deployed, advanced fighter squadrons, and naval facilities transforming the Arctic into forward military theater, was not independent Danish initiative, but rather American orchestrated operation using Denmark as a proxy to establish offensive capabilities threatening Russian Arctic bases, while controlling access routes between Atlantic and Arctic oceans. According to leaked NATO planning documents published by The Intercept on March 28th, Pentagon officials had been pressuring Denmark since late 2024 to dramatically expand military presence in Greenland, offering substantial financial assistance for infrastructure development, promising advanced weapons systems and intelligence sharing, and essentially threatening to pursue direct bilateral arrangements with Greenlandic authorities, bypassing Danish sovereignty if Copenhagen didn't cooperate with American Arctic strategy. The documents revealed that Denmark's January announcement of the New North strategy, tripling defense spending and establishing NATO Arctic Joint Force Command, was not spontaneous Danish decision, but rather response to American pressure, combined with Danish recognition that cooperating with U.S. demands provided opportunity to enhance Denmark's position within NATO while preventing even more aggressive American unilateral actions that would completely marginalize Danish authority over Greenland. The leaked documents show Pentagon viewing Greenland militarization as essential to multi-theater integrated deterrence, where capabilities positioned in Arctic can simultaneously threaten Russian northern bases. Secure transatlantic supply lines essential for reinforcing Europe, monitor Chinese attempts to use northern sea route, and position forces for rapid deployment to either European or North American operations. According to Sachs' analysis presented April 2nd, this American strategic concept treats Greenland not as Danish territory, whose militarization requires careful consideration of local indigenous populations and environmental impacts, but rather as strategic real estate to be exploited for American military advantage, regardless of consequences for Greenlanders, Danish sovereignty, or Arctic stability. The fact that Trump himself had previously expressed interest in purchasing Greenland demonstrates American view of the island as asset to be acquired rather than sovereign territory of ally, requiring respectful consultation. And this wasn't happening in isolation from the Iran escalation. That's been accelerating throughout 2026 as Trump administration abandoned Biden's attempts to negotiate return to nuclear deal framework and instead pursued maximum pressure 2.0 inches designed to force Iranian capitulation through combination of crippling sanctions, support for Iranian opposition groups, cyber attacks on Iranian infrastructure, and military threats of strikes against nuclear facilities. According to the Washington Post reporting from late March, intelligence assessments presented to Trump in February concluded that Iran was approximately 3 months from having sufficient enriched uranium for nuclear weapon if it decided to pursue weaponization, that sanctions were not preventing Iranian nuclear advances, but rather accelerating them as Iran lost incentive to show restraint, and that Israeli officials were preparing potential unilateral strikes on Iranian facilities if diplomatic pressure failed to halt progress, rather than recognizing these assessments as evidence that maximum pressure approach was failing and that diplomatic engagement might be necessary to prevent Iranian nuclear weapons. Trump administration interpreted them as justification for escalating pressure through additional sanctions targeting Iranian oil exports to China, increased support for Iranian opposition, including People's Mujahideen Organization, MEK, designated as terrorist organization by multiple governments, and explicit threats that military options, including strikes on nuclear facilities, remained on the table if Iran didn't halt enrichment. The result was predictable escalation, where Iran announced it would no longer cooperate with International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, expelled IAEA personnel from several facilities, and accelerated enrichment to 90% purity level suitable for weapons while moving centrifuges to underground facilities harder to destroy through airstrikes. Iranian officials made clear they viewed American pressure as existential threat requiring development of nuclear deterrent, abandoning previous policy of maintaining nuclear weapons options short of actual weaponization. According to Sachs's presentation, citing diplomatic cables from European allies, this represented exactly the outcome maximum pressure was supposed to prevent: Iran closer to nuclear weapons, more hostile to Western interests, and convinced that only nuclear deterrent could protect against American regime change. Operations that had destroyed governments in Iraq and Libya. Now, this isn't the first time multiple American foreign policy challenges have converged simultaneously, creating risks of overstretched capabilities and conflicting priorities, and historical examples reveal both how such situations emerge and how catastrophically they can end. Just think about how in late 1960s, the United States was simultaneously conducting major war in Vietnam, managing Cold War confrontation with Soviet Union, including nuclear arms race and proxy conflicts, dealing with Middle East tensions following Six-Day War, and attempting to manage domestic social upheaval from civil rights movement and anti-war protests. The convergence of these challenges exceeded American capabilities to manage all effectively, contributing to Vietnam War failure. domestic political crisis that forced Johnson not to seek re-election, and strategic opening for Soviet expansion that only ended with Reagan's military buildup 15 years later. The lesson was that even superpowers have limited bandwidth for managing multiple crises simultaneously, and attempting too much in too many places produces failures across multiple theaters. Then there was early 2000s when the United States was simultaneously conducting war in Afghanistan, attempting to build democracy and destroy al-Qaeda, invading Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein and supposedly find weapons of mass destruction, managing North Korea nuclear crisis through six-party talks, and dealing with Iranian nuclear program concerns. Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq while Afghanistan war was incomplete demonstrated hubris about American capabilities to transform multiple societies simultaneously through military force and political engineering. The result was catastrophic. Both Iraq and Afghanistan wars failed to achieve objectives. North Korea developed nuclear weapons while U.S. was distracted, and Iran accelerated its nuclear program while America's attention was divided. A Bush administration learned a painful lesson that American military might cannot overcome political, cultural, and strategic realities when attempting multiple simultaneous transformations. And let's not forget Obama administration's simultaneous management of Afghanistan withdrawal, Libya intervention, Syria civil war, Ukraine crisis, and Asia pivot, attempting to contain China, creating a situation where none of these challenges received sustained attention and resources necessary for successful outcomes. Libya intervention succeeded in removing Gaddafi but failed to prevent state collapse and civil war. Syria intervention through support for rebels prolonged conflict without achieving regime change. Ukraine received insufficient support to prevent Russian Crimea annexation. Asia pivot was more rhetorical than substantive given Middle East commitments. The pattern across multiple administrations demonstrates a consistent American tendency to initiate more operations than capabilities and attention can sustain. Now, it looks like Trump administration is repeating this pattern, but with dramatically higher stakes because operations are targeting governments supported by nuclear-armed adversaries willing to coordinate resistance rather than accepting American dominance. This is becoming all too familiar. American exceptionalism creates belief that the U.S. can accomplish anything if it demonstrates sufficient will and commits adequate resources, leading to simultaneous operations across multiple theaters that individually might be manageable but collectively exceed capabilities while creating escalation risks through interaction effects where failure in one theater encourages challenges in others. So what specific mechanisms did Sachs identify connecting Venezuela, Greenland, and Iran operations into a unified pattern demonstrating catastrophic strategic failure? Well, it all boils down to how all three operations follow identical regime change playbook regardless of specific circumstances, how failures in each theater reinforce rather than deter challenges in others, and how Russia and China are coordinating responses across all three situations in ways that create escalation dynamics exceeding anything American planners anticipated. The regime change playbook analysis showed that Venezuela, Greenland militarization as preparation for potential operations, and Iran all involved same sequential elements, characterizing target government as threat to American interests and values requiring removal, implementing economic sanctions designed to create crisis, undermining governments, legitimacy, supporting opposition groups regardless of the democratic credentials, conducting propaganda campaigns, building support for intervention, pursuing diplomatic isolation, and ultimately threatening or implementing military action. According to Sachs' documentation, Trump administration applied this playbook to Venezuela through recognizing Guaido as president, imposing sanctions, creating humanitarian crisis, supporting Venezuelan opposition and military defectors, conducting media campaign characterizing Maduro as dictator, and ultimately attempting direct control of oil infrastructure. Through executive order backed by threat of force, the operation failed catastrophically when Russia and China deployed forces preventing American control, but the playbook's application was textbook. The Greenland situation represents a preventive version of playbook where massive military buildup is occurring not because Greenland's government is target for regime change, but because island's strategic position is essential for operations against Russia and potentially China. According to Politico's reporting on Sachs' presentation, the Arctic militarization serves multiple regime change objectives, threatening Russian Arctic bases to pressure Moscow on various issues, including Ukraine, positioning capabilities for potential operations in northern Russia, securing supply lines for European reinforcement if NATO-Russia war occurred, and demonstrating American willingness to militarize previously stable regions to achieve strategic advantages. The fact that Denmark is implementing the militarization doesn't change American orchestration or strategic purposes. Iran operation follows playbook most explicitly, with Trump administration characterizing Islamic Republic as existential threat, supporting terrorism and pursuing nuclear weapons, reimposing sanctions after withdrawing from nuclear deal, supporting Iranian opposition, including MEK, despite its terrorist designation, conducting media campaign, emphasizing Iranian threats and human rights abuses, pursuing diplomatic isolation through alliance pressure, and threatening military strikes if Iran doesn't capitulate to American demands. According to The Guardian's reporting on Sachs' analysis, the Iran operation is following path toward either Iranian nuclear weapons acquisition or military confrontation because the playbook has no mechanism for actually achieving the stated objective of preventing Iranian nuclear capability through pressure. Alone, Iran will either develop weapons as deterrent or will be attacked, with both outcomes catastrophic. As the scholar presenting this analysis, Sachs has been attempting to build international pressure for changing course before disasters multiply and converge into uncontrollable crisis. He's been delivering presentations to diplomatic audiences, publishing analysis in academic journals and major media outlets, and directly briefing concerned members of Congress and foreign governments about escalation risks. His messaging emphasizes that this isn't typical foreign policy debate where reasonable people can disagree about tactics while sharing strategic objectives, but rather a fundamental crisis where current trajectory leads to catastrophic outcomes with high probability unless course is changed. He's trying to create sense of urgency that transcends normal political divisions by demonstrating that failures are already occurring. That playbook predicts further failures, and that great power war risk is real rather than hypothetical. At first, Trump administration officials dismissed Sachs' warnings as academic hand-wringing, disconnected from real-world necessity of confronting threats from hostile governments and demonstrating American strength to allies and adversaries. Why should United States accept Venezuelan resource nationalization benefiting Russia and China, allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons threatening Israel and Gulf allies, or permit Russian Arctic expansion without NATO response? From administration perspective, Sachs represents naive approach that would abandon American interests and encourage adversaries. But here's where Sachs's argument about convergence became impossible to ignore, even for skeptics. The simultaneous failures and escalations in all three theaters during March demonstrated that he was correct about a playbook producing catastrophic outcomes rather than strategic successes. While Sachs was attempting to build support for strategic reconsideration, Russia and China were demonstrating the coordinated resistance he had warned about through increasingly explicit statements and actions connecting their responses across all three situations. According to the Financial Times reporting on April 3rd, Russian and Chinese foreign ministers held joint press conference on March 30th, explicitly linking American actions in Venezuela, Arctic, and Iran as manifestations of single aggressive strategy requiring coordinated opposition. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated that forced American evacuation from Venezuela demonstrated that unilateral American actions violating sovereignty will be met with decisive resistance from nations defending international law, and that Russia would apply same principles to defending its Arctic interests against NATO encirclement and supporting Iran, against American regime change efforts. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi characterized American strategy as a desperate attempt to maintain unipolar dominance through military pressure across multiple regions simultaneously, warning that China would coordinate with Russia and other nations to ensure multipolar international order where American dictates cannot override sovereign rights. The explicit coordination and public statements connecting all three situations validated Sachs' analysis that these weren't separate regional challenges, but elements of broader confrontation between American interventionism and great power resistance. This was the moment when Sachs's convergence thesis became undeniable even to those who had dismissed his warnings. You see, when adversaries explicitly state their coordinating responses to treat separate American operations as unified challenge requiring unified resistance, the interconnections are no longer theoretical but declared policy. Russia and China weren't hiding coordination or maintaining ambiguity about whether they would support each other across different theaters. They were publicly announcing that American pressure anywhere would be met with coordinated resistance everywhere. That's definitely not an environment where American operations can be managed independently or where failures can be contained within specific regions without affecting other theaters. And then the military incidents began accelerating in ways that demonstrated how dangerous convergence was becoming. On April 1st, according to Reuters reporting, Russian submarines were detected operating near NATO naval facilities in Greenland in what U.S. officials characterized as reconnaissance, preparing for potential operations against newly established bases. NATO responded by deploying additional anti-submarine warfare assets, while Russia announced it would conduct major Arctic exercises in May demonstrating capability to strike NATO installations. The incident showed how Greenland militarization was already triggering Russian military responses, creating escalation dynamics in Arctic. Simultaneously, Iranian-backed groups in Iraq launched drone attacks on U.S. facilities on March 29th, which Pentagon officials attributed to Iranian retaliation for American support for protests inside Iran. The attacks didn't cause casualties, but demonstrated Iranian capability to strike American forces throughout region. Trump administration officials threatened military retaliation if attacks continued, to which Iranian officials responded that any strikes on Iranian territory or interests would trigger comprehensive response, including possible closure of Strait of Hormuz, choking off substantial portion of global oil supply. But then, when confronted with these escalating incidents across multiple theaters, Trump administration's response demonstrated exactly the problem Sachs had identified, rather than recognizing that simultaneous operations were exceeding American capabilities and creating unacceptable escalation risks. Officials argued that incidents proved necessity of increased pressure to deter adversaries and demonstrate American resolve. According to the Washington Post reporting on April 4th, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz circulated memo arguing that Russian submarine operations near Greenland and Iranian attacks on U.S. forces proved that restraint and diplomatic engagement were interpreted as weakness, and that only escalation, demonstrating American willingness to use force, would deter further provocations. The memo proposed responding to Russian Arctic activities by increasing NATO exercises and forward deployments, responding to Iranian attacks by striking Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps facilities and returning to Venezuela with larger military presence, backed by explicit commitment to remove Maduro, regardless of Russian-Chinese opposition. In the eyes of Sachs and other critics, this response represented textbook example of escalation spiral, where each side interprets the other's defensive measures as provocations requiring responses that make situation more dangerous. From American perspective, Russian submarines and Iranian attacks were unprovoked aggression requiring strong responses. From Russian and Iranian perspectives, they were defending against American regime change operations and military buildups, threatening their security. Neither side could admit that their own actions were contributing to crisis because that would require acknowledging that their strategy was flawed. Now, this left Allied governments watching American strategy with increasing alarm because they would be directly affected by any conflicts that emerge from Trump administration's simultaneous operations. On one side, European NATO members were committed to alliance obligations and generally supported confronting Russian expansion, but they were deeply concerned that Greenland militarization and potential Venezuela operations would trigger Russian responses affecting European security while serving primarily American interests rather than collective defense, according to European diplomatic cables leaked to Der Spiegel. German, French, and Italian officials were privately urging restraint and warning that European publics would not support involvement in conflicts resulting from American regime change operations they viewed as unnecessary and counterproductive. On the flip side, Middle Eastern allies, including Saudi Arabia and UAE, were concerned that American-Iranian confrontation would destabilize region and potentially draw them into conflict with Iranian proxies throughout region. These allies wanted Iranian nuclear program contained, but worried that maximum pressure was pushing Iran toward weapons rather than preventing them. The tricky part is that Trump administration's strategy depended on allied support for sanctions enforcement, intelligence sharing, and potentially military contributions, but allies were becoming increasingly reluctant to support operations they viewed as reckless. So American officials were caught between needing allied cooperation to implement strategy and allied resistance to participating in operations with dubious legal foundations and questionable prospects of success. This whole crisis is causing fundamental questions about American credibility and alliance cohesion because simultaneous failures are damaging American reputation for competence, while Allied reluctance to support operations is revealing limits of U.S. ability to generate coalition support for controversial initiatives. If the United States cannot convince close allies to support its Venezuela, Greenland, and Iran strategies, what does that mean for American global leadership and ability to coordinate responses to actual threats requiring collective action? According to Council on Foreign Relations analysis published April 5th, the combination of operational failures like Venezuela evacuation and allied distancing creates a perception of declining American power and leadership that could accelerate adversary challenges and allied hedging. When allies question American judgment and adversaries successfully resist American pressure, other nations may conclude that alignment with Washington is risky bet rather than insurance policy. Things became even more complex when domestic American politics began reflecting international concerns about Trump administration strategy. According to Politico, reporting on April 6th, a growing number of congressional Democrats and some Republicans began questioning whether Trump had legal authority for operations in Venezuela and potential Iran strikes, demanding briefings on strategy and costs, and threatening to restrict funding for operations lacking congressional authorization. The political opposition wasn't just partisan resistance, but reflected genuine concerns about escalation risks and strategic wisdom that transcended party lines. Several Republican senators with foreign policy experience, including Rand Paul, expressed reservations about simultaneous confrontations with multiple adversaries, while Democratic senators demanded administration explain what success would look like and how operations would be concluded, rather than becoming endless commitments. The international, legal, and institutional response has been devastating for American position because multiple international bodies have condemned American actions while Russia and China use these condemnations to build diplomatic support for their resistance. The International Court of Justice issued ruling on April 7th, characterizing attempted Venezuela seizure as a clear violation of sovereignty, calling for all states to refuse recognition of American claims to control Venezuelan resources, and stating that international community should support Venezuelan sovereignty against external interference, while ruling has no enforcement mechanism given U.S. non-recognition of ICJ compulsory jurisdiction. It provides legal foundation for opposition to American operations. The UN General Assembly scheduled emergency session for April 10th to consider resolution condemning American interventionism and calling for respect for sovereignty, which diplomatic observers expect to pass with overwhelming majority given widespread opposition to American unilateralism. Legal experts and international relations scholars are noting that simultaneous American operations are fundamentally undermining rules-based international order that U.S. claims to defend. According to analysis from European Journal of International Law, published April 8th, when United States violates sovereignty in Venezuela, militarizes Arctic through pressure on Denmark, and threatens Iran with military action to prevent exercise of nuclear technology rights under non-proliferation treaty, while claiming to defend international law and norms, the hypocrisy delegitimizes entire normative framework if law applies differently to powerful nations than to weak ones. It's not law, but rather power politics dressed in legal language. The analysis argues that American actions are accelerating transition from liberal international order based on rules and institutions to spheres of influence system based purely on relative power. Former government officials are expressing alarm about Trump administration strategy in remarkably blunt terms, unusual for foreign policy establishment. According to interviews published in The Atlantic on April 9th, multiple former defense secretaries, CIA directors, and national security advisors warned that simultaneous operations targeting governments supported by Russia and China without realistic plans for success or de-escalation represented strategic malpractice, creating avoidable risks of great power war. William Perry, who served as defense secretary under Clinton and dealt with nuclear security issues throughout his career, stated that a current situation involves greater risk of accidental or inadvertent escalation to nuclear conflict than any period since Cuban Missile Crisis because of multiple confrontation points, complex alliance dynamics, and absence of crisis communication mechanisms between Washington and Beijing comparable to Cold War hotlines, when warnings come from officials who manage Cold War nuclear standoffs and understand escalation risks intimately, using language comparing current situation to Cuban Missile Crisis, that suggests genuine alarm transcending partisan politics or ideological disputes about interventionism. The implications for international security architecture are potentially transformative because a convergence of American operations with coordinated Russian-Chinese resistance is accelerating bloc formation and comprehensive great power competition that makes cooperation on shared challenges nearly impossible. From strategic perspective, the world is dividing into competing camps with diminishing space for neutrality or issue-specific cooperation. According to Foreign Affairs analysis published April 10th, nations are being pressured to choose alignment with either American-led bloc or Russia-China axis, with both sides punishing nations attempting to maintain balanced relationships. This polarization affects everything from trade and technology to climate cooperation and pandemic response. As all issues become securitized and evaluated through lens of strategic competition rather than shared interests, the climate cooperation dimension is particularly tragic because Arctic is experiencing faster warming than any region on Earth, requiring urgent coordinated action. But Greenland militarization and Arctic tensions are making such cooperation impossible if NATO and Russia are preparing for potential warfare in the Arctic. They cannot simultaneously cooperate on environmental protection and sustainable development. The broader pattern of American operations undermining cooperation with Russia and China on climate change, pandemic preparedness, nuclear non-proliferation, and other global challenges that require coordination regardless of political differences represents enormous opportunity cost that may prove more damaging to human welfare than any specific regime change operation. So let's break down what this convergence crisis that Sachs has documented actually means for a future of international security and American foreign policy. Because it's not just about three simultaneous operations that happen to be failing. It has profound implications for whether great power war can be avoided, whether international order based on rules or power will define 21st century, and whether American foreign policy establishment can recognize failures and adapt before disasters become catastrophic. First and most immediately, Trump administration is pursuing regime change operations in 3 theaters simultaneously against governments supported by Russia and China who are explicitly coordinating resistance, creating escalation risks that exceed American capabilities to manage and that could trigger conflicts spreading beyond anyone's ability to control. The credibility implications for the United States are catastrophic because Venezuela evacuation demonstrated that American unilateral actions can be reversed when opposed by coordinated adversaries, damaging deterrence and encouraging challenges across multiple regions. Every subsequent operation now carries a burden of the proving American commitment and capability after high-profile failure, creating pressure for escalation to restore credibility even when escalation is strategically unwise. For Greenland specifically, the island has become both symbol of American strategic overreach and potential flashpoint for Arctic conflict that could draw European NATO members into war they don't support over territory whose militarization they question. Greenlanders are caught in great power competition they didn't seek and cannot control, with their lands being transformed into military theater, regardless of indigenous preferences. The precedent-setting implications suggest that failed American regime change operations will not lead to strategic reconsideration, but rather to escalation, attempting to recover credibility through demonstrating resolve, creating doom loop, where failures produce escalations that produce further failures, requiring additional escalations. This pattern cannot continue indefinitely without eventually triggering catastrophic miscalculation or deliberate confrontation. The ultimate question facing humanity is whether Sachs' warnings about convergence crisis will be heeded before disasters he predicts materialize, or whether warnings will be dismissed as alarmist until events prove them tragically prescient. His analysis suggests that current trajectory leads inevitably to great power confrontations that could escalate to nuclear war, and that only fundamental reconsideration of American interventionist strategy can prevent catastrophe. But such reconsideration requires acknowledging that regime change playbook has failed consistently, that current operations are failing predictably, and that American power has limits that must be accepted rather than denied. The foreign policy establishment's ability or willingness to make such acknowledgments, while they still matter rather than only after disasters, make denial impossible, will determine whether Sachs' contribution is remembered as warning that saved humanity from unnecessary war, or as prophecy that nobody heeded until catastrophe made it too late to matter.